Welcome to the Canadian Institute of Forestry's National Electronic Lecture Program. My name is Madison Van Camp, and I will be hosting today's session. Today is Thursday, April 30th, 2026, and this is the last session in the E-Lecture series entitled Growing Climate Resilient Urban Forests, Species Selection and Assisted Migration Strategies. This series is brought to you by Tree Canada. The CIF-IFC is very pleased to collaborate with Dr. Adrina Bardekjian and the team at Tree Canada to host these webinars. Today's webinar is titled Tree Migration in Canada, Past, Present, and Future. A special reminder that the ISA certified arborists are eligible to receive one continuing education unit for this webinar. Please email electures@cififc.org with your full name and your ISA certified ID in order to obtain the ISA continuing education unit. Once we verify your attendance, we will send your information to ISA for them to process. Today we have Kaylee Hutt-Taylor, Coordinator of Research and Engagement from Tree Canada, to introduce today's e-lecture speaker. So with that, I will now pass it over to Kaylee.
Thanks, Madison, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. On behalf of Tree Canada, I just wanted to thank you again for taking the time to join us today for this e-lecture session, the last in the series, as mentioned. We're really pleased to be bringing together forestry professionals to explore this topic of climate resilient urban forests through species selection, assisted migration, functional traits in planning and planting in urban forestry. This was a topic that we've heard a lot from our audience is very important and pertinent right now, so I'm very happy to see it come to fruition in this series. As always, I want to thank Madison and Sharon and the team at CIF for the help coordinating and partnering with us on this series. So I'm looking forward to learning today alongside all of you. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, John, today. John Pedlar is a research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service, working at the Great Lakes Forestry Centre in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. He obtained a Bachelor of Science at University of Guelph and a Master's of Science in Ecology at Carleton University. His research focuses on how climate and climate change affect plant distribution, survival, and growth. As part of this work, he was involved in updates to the Canadian Plant Hardiness Zone map in 2014 and 2025. His further studies how adaptive forestry approaches such as assisted migration can help to mitigate climate change impacts. John, please go ahead and start your presentation.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be able to join everyone virtually today. And I'd like to just start by saying thanks to the organizers for inviting me to speak today. So that's Maddie and Sharon and Kaylee. And I'd also like to recognize the contributions of my co-author, Dan McKenney. Dan and I have been working together here at the Great Lakes Forestry Center for many years and covering a variety of topics, chief among them being climate change, species distributions. So those will really be sort of at the focus of the talk today. And lastly, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Sault Ste. Marie on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people, specifically the Garden River First Nation, the Batchewana First Nation, and the Métis Nation. And this land is covered by the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. So for the talk today, I'd like to start off by talking about the basics of tree migration. We'll then talk briefly about a history of glaciation in North America. And we'll talk about post-glacial tree migration and some of the migration rates that trees achieved at that time. We'll talk about recent tree migration using forest inventory data. And then we'll talk about future tree migration and the expected rates that trees would have to attain in order to shift in synchrony with the expected projected changes due to climate change. And about the last half of the talk, we'll talk about assisted migration, some different types of assisted migration, tools that have been developed, some trials that are underway, and trends that are sort of pointing the way towards the future in this area. So Tree Migration 101. I start with the sentence that migration is an inherently slow process for trees. When I say that, I recognize that for many tree species, in good years, many seeds can be produced. For example, in a good year, a single white pine tree might produce up to 50,000 seeds. But The issue is that the vast majority of those seeds are going to land close to the parent tree. I'm showing that in the graph shown here that shows by the time you've reached 200 meters, nearly all the seeds have landed. There are some rare long distance dispersal events, and those are important, but those are certainly not the norm. And then once a seed lands, it's got to hope that it's landed in a suitable location for establishment. That requires the right biotic and abiotic conditions for growth. And if by chance that happens and the seed is able to establish at that location, then it's got to survive for maybe another up to 50 years, in some cases for northern trees, before it's reproductively mature and able to start that process again. And right at the heart of tree migration, of course, is tree seeds. This is maybe a little bit unnecessary for this talk, but this is a topic of interest for me. So I thought I'd show you, a sampling of seeds associated with native Canadian tree species. And I've kind of arranged them from the smallest, primarily wind dispersed seeds up in the left-hand corner. And as we move clockwise, the seeds get bigger and are more typically animal dispersed. And just to point out a few interesting seeds that I've got shown you here, they've got the trembling aspen, which has quite small seeds and small sort of cottony plumes associated with them, which obviously helps them with their wind-based dispersal. And we get through to sort of more mid-sized seeds like American beeches and red oaks that would typically be moved around by things like squirrels and maybe even bears. And then things like black walnut and pawpaw, which are really quite large seeds. The pawpaw is a tree that's found only in far southern Ontario. It has this mango-like fruit, which I've never tasted, but I'd like to someday. I have seen the tree in the wild, though. But again, that's being dispersed primarily by things like squirrels and raccoons that would be attracted to those fruits. I've also shown the Kentucky coffee tree on here because this has always been a bit of an enigma to me as far as seed dispersal goes. If, again, this is another tree species that's found only in far southern Ontario, so I don't see it too often. But anytime I would see it, I would see these large seed pods lying on the ground right below the tree and no evidence that they've been moved around at all. So I always wondered what moves around these pods and seeds associated with the Kentucky coffee tree. And researchers suggest that this is a bit of an anachronism, harkening back to a time when there were other seed dispersers roaming North America, some of these large megafauna that we hear about, things like mastodons and giant sloths that would have actually been suited to eating these pods and moving the seeds around. All right, so before we can really talk about tree migration historically in North America, we need to do a brief review of glaciation in North America. I just start by giving a little plug for this book that I'm using for this information here. It's an older book. It was published in 1991 by a woman named Chris Pellew, and I find it a very accessible book, and I would highly recommend it if you're interested in reading on this topic of glaciation. But it's important to keep in mind that North America has been experienced repeated glaciations over time. We're currently in what would have thought to have been a relatively short interglacial period. There's evidence suggesting that with current levels of greenhouse gases and climate change, that relatively short period is going to be extended considerably, maybe out to 100,000 years before we'd be seeing another ice age. But the last glacial maximum was about 20,000 years ago. This was known as the Wisconsin Ice Age because the ice sheets reached as far south as present-day Wisconsin. And over that 20,000 year period to present, those glaciers have receded, moved northward, and by about 5,000 years before present, the landscape was looking a fair bit like it is today. And during that time of the glacial maximum, then trees in North America would have to persist in southern refugia. And for some time, there's been interest in how exactly these trees moved back, recolonized these northern areas, and the rate at which they did that. So a large amount of information about post-glacial tree migration rates came from fossil pollen studies. There was a real explosion in this kind of work between about 30 and 50 years ago. Basically, this work involves sampling, coring the bottom of lakes, typically where pollen rain has built up in layers over the years. And researchers are able to actually identify that fossil pollen to species for trees. And they're able to date it using carbon-14 dating techniques. So not like cutting edge technology, but pretty interesting stuff still. And from this work and from developing a wide network of samples across, say, Eastern North America, scientists were able to piece together tentative distributions of trees through time. And I'm showing a couple of these from a 1987 paper with the top row of maps for beech and the bottom row of maps for maple. And we can see how there's, using this fossil pollen research, we're able to tentatively identify how those distributions expanded through time. And so based on this fossil pollen work, researchers estimated rates around 100 kilometers per century or even higher for many tree species. There was always some skepticism around those numbers. I think people sort of found them a bit high based on sort of current evidence for current levels of migration. And there was always some uncertainty around those rates based on the pollen, because pollen is so light it can be blown significant distances. So there was thought to be the potential for some artifacts around pollen showing up in lakes before the trees had actually arrived there. So recent studies using macrofossils that don't suffer from same sort of potential wind-based artifacts, and also genetic marker studies have suggested rates of between about 10 and 50 kilometers per century. And this seems to be a sort of generally agreed upon rate for these post-glacial tree migrations. And I've highlighted that here because it's important. We're going to keep that in mind as we move forward in the talk and talk about the rates that trees might have to achieve to keep up with climate change. So fast forwarding about 5 or 10,000 years here, we're undergoing a changing climate again. Over the past century or so, there's good evidence that around the world there's been increases in mean annual temperature of about a degree of Celsius. That's likely higher here in Canada, looking more like about 1.5 degrees of Celsius or more. So that raises the question of, are trees showing evidence of migrating in this most recent climate change era? And the nice thing about that is we have some good data sets to look into that. We have forest inventory data, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. And typically this is plot-based data that people identify the forest composition in each of those plots across an area of interest. That might be across a province or across the whole country. And then by repeatedly assessing that forest composition through time, you're able to assess and look for changes in distribution over time. And typically, people working in this area will make a distinction between mature trees and saplings, as saplings are more likely to be showing that climate or that dispersal signal before the older mature trees do. And I'm showing an image here from work from Laura Boisvert-Marsh et al. In 2014 that shows sort of modest shifts in black spruce that they were able to measure from using inventory data from Quebec over about a 30-year period. So there's been a number of these studies that have looked at used forest inventory data to look for shifts in tree distributions in the recent past. And I'm not going to get into details on each of these studies, but a couple of main messages. The top two studies there are for Quebec and cover a variety of boreal and temperate tree species. And both of these studies reported average northward shifts, and they were kind of in the range of, I'll say, about 10 to 20 kilometers per century in that area. And that is sort of comfortably fitting into the low end of what we were talking about previously for velocity of shifts in the post-glacial era. The other thing I wanted to note was that in these bottom two studies, which didn't report on average shifts, but they talked about how consistent shifts were across species. And both of these studies reported more than 80% of species showing no evidence of northward shifts. So I would take from that in this current era of climate change, there's really no coherent shift apparent in trees yet. And for some species that are showing shifts, it's kind of in that relatively modest shift rate that we've seen in the past between about 10 and 50 kilometers per century. So I'd like to shift gears now and talk about the projections for future shifts in tree climate envelopes. So this is something that we looked at. Well, it doesn't seem that long ago, but I guess it's almost 20 years ago. And what we did was we looked at shifts in climate habitat for 130 different tree species in North America. And with this work, we were able to generate models and maps of current climate habitat for each of these 130 tree species. And then we were able to look at how that is projected to shift in the future. And we looked at this over a 100-year period, so between 1971 to 2000 and 2071 to 2100. And what we found was that there was, on average, relatively modest decline in size of climate envelopes projected over that 100-year period, a 12% decline on average. But we found a very large shift projected as far as the northward shift goes, and that was of about 700 kilometers over that 100-year period. So when we compare that 700 kilometers per century to what we're seeing in the past of 10 to 50 kilometers per century, clearly there's a significant disparity between trees' abilities to migrate and the rate at which climate change is shifting. And just to kind of put a bow on this topic, then one other line of studies that I wanted to mention are these migration simulation studies. So in this type of study, it's kind of a combination of what I was talking about previously, where you're looking at future shifts in climate habitats, but you're overlaying on that projections from migration simulation models that basically are mechanistic models that take into account details on the life history of species and how they migrate, and making an estimate of how that species is actually going to migrate through time. There's a couple of studies we were involved with, one by Prasad et al. In 2020 and another by Boisvert-Marsh et al. In 2022. And perhaps not surprisingly, given the evidence I've provided so far, both studies concluded that trees have limited capacity to track projected climate shifts. And I'm just showing you an image here from the Boisvert-Marsh et al. Study in 2022 for white pine for the end of the current century under a moderate emission scenario. And the green areas on this map are locations where white pine is expected to persist by the end of the current century. The blue areas are locations where it has potential to migrate into in the coming decades. And then the white area is the area where new climate habitat has become available over the course of the current century, but is not been colonized because of a lack of ability to migrate over that time period into that area. So given these many sort of lines of evidence that suggest that trees aren't going to be able to keep up with climate shifts, it's not surprising that approaches have emerged to help mitigate climate change impacts on forests. And one of the main ones that people have looked into is this notion of assisted migration. Now, this may be something many of you online have heard about already, but I'll give you some background just so that we're all on the same page with this. And this involves movement of organisms to climatically suitable locations outside traditional range limits in response to climate change. It's a concept that's been around since the mid-1980s, and the original focus of it was really with preservation of species, so trying to avoid species extinctions under climate change. But since that time, the concept has evolved to consider other units of life, so not just species, but populations, and at the superspecies level, like whole assemblages of species. And it's also evolved to consider other objectives, so not just avoiding extinction, but also maintaining or even enhancing ecosystem services, so things like timber values and carbon sequestration. Assisted migration has certainly come with some debate around it, and this isn't really surprising given that it sort of stands in contrast to existing conservation paradigms that really focus on managing species within existing range limits. And opponents to AM certainly point to the potential for creating invasive species and the many examples of humans doing that, either intentionally or unintentionally, by moving species around. One needs to look no further than Phragmites or dog strangling vine to see examples of the damaging effects that invasive species can have. But proponents argue that these risks can be managed as long as we're careful about which species we're moving and how far we're moving them. They also point out that, given that climate change changes everything, that species and ecosystem services will be lost if bold action isn't taken. One of the things that's helped to move the assisted migration debate along is that there's been a recognition that there's different types of assisted migration, each with different levels of risk. I've laid out 3 of them here. So one type is assisted gene flow that refers to the movement of populations within existing species range limits. And clearly that has implications for the risks involved in creating an invasive species, given that we're not really introducing a new species to any location. There's assisted range expansion that refers to modest movements beyond existing range limits, so probably in the realm of, say, 1 to 200 kilometers here in relatively flat eastern Canada. And then there's long-range assisted migration, which is a bit of a vague term, but it refers to moving species hundreds or thousands of kilometers into entirely new ecosystems. And clearly there's some different risks involved with these different types of assisted migration. So I'd like to talk now about some assisted migration tools that we've been involved in developing. The first one I wanted to talk about is one called Seedware, which is a climate matching tool. And basically this is a web application that identifies location on a map that have climate similar to a point of interest. It's available publicly at the website provided here. And it employs what's called a Gower index to calculate climate similarity. And the nice thing about this index is it can be used with any number of climate variables. So at the website, users can select from several different climate variables when undertaking a Seedware analysis. And it's also been developed to incorporate climate change. So what I mean by that, I'll illustrate on these figures that are shown on the slide. In the top figure, we've identified a point of interest on the Bruce Peninsula in southern Ontario, shown by the sort of gray marker. And the analysis identifies locations that have climate that, in the absence of climate change, locations that have similar climate to that location of interest. And so those areas are shown in warmer colors like the oranges and yellows on this map. And so if one was looking for seed sources to plant at this location of interest, given the historical importance of maintaining local seed sources for a planting site, because the theory is that local seed sources are adapted to the climate at that planting site, one might consider looking for seed sources in these areas with climate that is similar to that of the planting site. Now, under climate change, that notion of using local seed sources really doesn't apply as much anymore because that local climate is shifting northward. So what you're trying to match now is the near future climate at your planting site to seed sources that would be adapted to that near future climate at your planting site. So in this bottom map, we've swapped out the current climate at our planting site of interest on the Bruce Peninsula, and instead we're looking at climate that's projected for that location in about 30 years. And what the analysis now is showing us is locations that currently have climate that's similar to that that's expected at our planting site of interest in about 30 years. And so these might be suitable locations, the oranges and yellows in southern Ontario and in the United States, places like New York and Pennsylvania as well. These might be suitable locations to look for seed sources under climate change. So that seedware analysis is great in that it provides a map of climate similarities with nice colors that help guide us a bit. But what it doesn't answer is the question of how similar is similar enough. So to help with that question, we've been involved in developing something called critical seed transfer distances. And this is a tool that was originally developed by Greg O'Neill and colleagues in British Columbia. And basically these indicate how far seeds can be moved before unacceptable growth losses occur. And these tools have typically been developed using range-wide provenance data. And from that range-wide provenance data, we can develop transfer functions which allow us to see how far seeds can be moved and still attain good growth. I've sort of tried to show that in the schematic diagram on the right, where we have a schematic, stylized provenance trial at the top with seed sources planted at test sites across the range of the species. By measuring the growth of those seed sources at those sites, we can basically generate a graph that shows the relationship between how well a seed source grows as a function of how far it's been transferred. And by setting cutoffs like 90 or 95%, we're able to sort of basically draw a circle around the seed sources that maintain good growth despite being moved some distance to that planting site. So we've calculated these critical seed transfer distances for 5 major tree species in Canada, and we've published those results in the article shown here. And one of the main takeaways from that study was that the critical seed transfer distances were relatively large across species. Like all of the species, data suggested that movements of northward of 5 degrees Celsius of mean annual temperature were relatively safe. In fact, some of them were significantly higher than 5 degrees Celsius of mean annual temperature. But again, here in eastern Canada, where things are relatively flat, that would translate into a distance of between 400 and 500 kilometers. So on the plus side, this means seed transfer systems can be relatively flexible. They're relatively coarse. You don't need to find the exact place down to the half kilometer for where a seed source should be used for a planting site. There's a fair bit of play there. But at the same time, all this flexibility does make one wonder about how strong those local adaptations are to climate, and that's really what's at the basis of these within range seed source movements. So I'm just going to park that question there. I raise it here, but I'm going to revisit that in a few slides. Another type of tool that we've been involved in developing is the climate niche models. And basically, these are maps that show where suitable climate is for a species. We develop these under current climate, and once we know what the suitable climate is under current conditions, we're able to project that onto maps of future climate as well. So basically, this gives us a sense of what species might be suitable currently and in the future for a planting site of interest. So in order to develop these models and maps, we've gathered occurrence data from across North America. I won't get into a lot of details at this point about what those various data sources are. There's a number of them, but I'd be happy to discuss it further if that's of interest. And then we've merged that occurrence data with climate data. And from that, we're able to generate these climate envelope models. And we've been able to generate those models for about 6,000 different plant species, and those are all available at the website shown at the bottom of the slide. I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but we employ 2 different modeling approaches, ANUCLIM and MaxEnt. for developing these models, and Annuclim is sort of an earlier generation, fairly simplistic, straightforward method, whereas Maxent is more modern machine learning, black box type approach. But interestingly enough, they give relatively similar results. The example maps I'm showing here are Annuclim maps, and nice thing about Annuclim is that it shows both a core range in green on these maps, which is sort of the preferred climate conditions for the species, and then a full range shown in orange, which is sort of all the potential places that have climate that could be suitable for this species. A few more things then about these climate envelope tools. At the website, users can search for a plant species of interest and select that species. Then they can also select a time period, emission scenario, and model, or a global circulation model of interest. And then they will be provided maps based on those selections. And those maps can be downloaded for post-processing based on the objectives of users' work. One other thing I wanted to mention about the plant hardiness website is that it's also got a function called Plants in My Area, and this allows users to input either their municipality or a location of interest in decimal degrees. Then they would also select a time period of interest, and then the application provides a list of species that, from a climatic perspective, could be suitable for that location and time period. And these are species then that would have overlap that location with their core range in that time period. So this is a way to get a sense of what species might do well at your location under current or future conditions. And these lists are downloadable again, so you could further filter and sort them as needed. Okay, I'd like to switch gears again now and talk about results from some assisted migration field trials. We've been involved with a few different trials over the years, and I'm going to focus today on some results from some oak trials in southern Ontario. These are trials that we've been involved with in collaboration with the Forest Gene Conservation Association. And this particular study involves 5 different trials across southern Ontario. The trial locations are shown in the map at the bottom of the slide. And these trials include a variety of oak species, including red, white, burr, and swamp white oak, and a variety of seed sources, typically Ontario, the local seed source, and then Pennsylvania and Tennessee. So I'm going to focus in here on just one of those 5 study sites, which is fairly representative of the whole study, and that is a study site known as Holst, which is shown by the yellow star on the small map inset here. And at this site, there's 2 different oak species, red and white oak. And for each of those species, we have 3 different seed sources. We have a local Ontario Seed Zone 37 seed source. We have a seed source from Pennsylvania about 500 kilometers to the south, and one from Tennessee about 1,000 kilometers to the south. The site was planted in 2010 and measured at age 9 for red oak and age 13 for white oak. And so just to give you a brief summary of some of the results we've seen, I guess these would be somewhat preliminary at these young ages, but for white oak, we've seen no significant difference between those different seed sources in terms of height or survival. I would note that when we look over on the survival map in panel B, there does seem to be an effect with the Tennessee seed source having sort of notably lower survival than, say, the Ontario source, but due to sort of lower power to the test with only, I think, 6 replicates, that's not being identified as a statistically significant result. So I'd call it sort of marginally significant. As far as red oak goes, the local seed source grew significantly better than the other sources, but there's no significant difference with respect to survival. So what do we take from these results? Well, I would say that it certainly seems relatively safe to be moving seed sources from as far away as Pennsylvania. That's the 500 kilometers to the south. There's not a lot of evidence of significant either survival or growth impacts with movements from that distance. The Tennessee is maybe a bit arguable with that marginally significant impact on survival. But one could make the argument, looking at these graphs, that Tennessee, like movements of 1,000 kilometers, might also be reasonable as far as assisted migration goes. But I did want to caution against that, and I wanted to show you these other results that could be considered a bit of a caution against those length of movements. So another aspect of that work at that same host site was that in 2024, during a thinning operation, we took tree cookies from each of those different seed sources that were planted at that site. And we've been able to analyze the growth rings from the different seed sources. And that's what I'm showing you here. Again, relatively preliminary results, but we see the growth rings through time for the 3 different seed sources. And there's some shifting around, but they're relatively similar up until an extreme event in 2021 that hit all 3 different seed sources. And we think that was a late frost in May that happened. And interestingly enough, since then, the local and the Pennsylvanian seed sources have bounced back relatively quickly to pre-event levels, but Tennessee is lagging behind and still seems to be showing effects of that extreme event. So that is, an example of how one can move plants some distance, and they might do well at a location for some time, but it's these extreme events that sort of make it clear that there are adaptation issues. And so that's why we wouldn't necessarily recommend, for example, movements as far as that 1,000 kilometers for that Tennessee seed source. Well, I'd mentioned earlier that I'd return to this issue of movement distances because that's been, a lot of the focus of our research, and I've presented several lines of research that suggest broad movement distances on the range of 400 to 500 kilometers may be relatively safe for trees. And on the plus side, this suggests significant flexibility for moving seed sources northward. But it may also suggest modest gains for assisted migration. And to explain this, I've got some figures here below. And in panel A, I am showing some hypothetical, what we call response curves for 2 different seed sources. There's a cold origin seed source in blue and a warm origin seed source in red. And what we'd expect to see if we have strong local adaptation, which is really what's at the heart of these within range movements, we'd expect to see optimal growth at the temperature associated with the local site. And we'd expect to see, as you planted those seeds in other locations that had either colder or warmer situations, we'd expect to see that growth decline fairly quickly as you move away from that local optimum. In the second panel here, panel B, I'm showing not a hypothetical situation, but actual response curves for 2 populations of black spruce. The cold origin population is from northern Ontario. The warm origin population is from southern Michigan. And what we see is that there's an awful lot of overlap between these 2 different curves. And so if we were to, say, move that warm origin population, it would be about 6 degrees Celsius of a northward movement if we were to move it to the location of the cold origin population. But in making that movement, we wouldn't necessarily be getting an entirely new temperature profile that's being covered. We wouldn't be getting quite as much climate change resilience as we might have thought if we were getting very different local adaptation between those populations. So this is something we've seen. I'm showing here on the far right. This is, lest you think I just cherry picked a couple of curves that meet this hypothesis. This is the full of family of different response curves for black spruce from that study, and you can see that there's an awful lot of overlap there as far as those response curves go. So this is something I wanted to make you aware of, that these movements, while we're finding there's a lot of flexibility with northward movements, part of the reason for that is that there's a lot of overlap in terms of these response curves, and that may mean that we're not getting quite as much climate change resilience out of these movements as we think. So that's something we'll be looking into in future studies. I wanted to finish by talking about some assisted migration trends. I talked about some smaller scale assisted migration trials that we're involved with, but one of the trends in this area is the move towards large scale assisted migration trials. And I've listed a number of them here. They all have sort of interesting acronyms like AMAT and ASK and DREAM and eNames and TransX. And they're all quite large scale studies that involve sort of operational level assisted migration treatments. I'm just showing you an example here of the TransX project, and that's showing the study sites in the top map, and clearly those cover a good portion of Eastern Canada and even down into the United States. And then below I show the experimental design at each of those study sites, and without going into a lot of details here, the point is that there's 16 replications, and in each replication there's 10 different species, and for each species 6 different seed sources. So it's really a fairly extensive study, and I'll be watching with interest to see what kind of results come out of this in the coming years. And the other sort of trend related bit of information I wanted to provide was sort of an update on the implementation of assisted migration work in Canada. Much of the work that's been moving ahead in sort of a large scale way is within range movement, that assisted gene flow type movements, and a number of provinces have moved ahead and developed climate-based seed transfer systems that involved assisted gene flow. So British Columbia led the way in 2017, and that was followed by Ontario in 2021. And I know there are a number of other provinces that are actively moving ahead in this area as well. Certainly Quebec and Alberta are on the verge, or possibly even there, as far as developing their climate-based seed transfer systems as well. On the other hand, there have been relatively few projects involving large-scale beyond range movements. And I think this is a testament to people, genuinely being concerned about moving species beyond existing range limits and the potential negative impacts that could come with that. Once again, British Columbia has led the way here, though. They have allowed the movement of western larch into areas outside of current natural range limits. It's a relatively limited distance that they're moving them, and a relatively limited amount of seed source material, but nonetheless, that is part of their policy there now. So, in summary, I'd say thanks for listening, and hopefully it's made some points here that trees have been migrating around Canada and North America for millennia. And paleo evidence suggests historical migration rates in that 10 to 50 kilometer range. And inventory-based studies suggest maybe there's no evidence for coherent northward shifts yet, although some species seem to be moving in that same at that same rate as the historical migration rate. This is in contrast to projected climate habitat shifts, where movements velocities around 700 kilometers per century would be required to keep up with climate change. And so assisted migration has been suggested as an adaptation tool to help conserve species and help maintain forest growth and survival under climate change. I've talked about numerous tools and trials that have been developed and are underway to assist with assisted migration, and we're seeing that being worked into forest plans and forest management across the country. particularly those within range movements. And just a little plug for some work we're doing here at GLFC. We're starting to examine the economics of implementing assisted migration at scale, and we think it'll be interesting to really see what's involved, because at some level those economic questions are very important for whether these silvicultural techniques are pushed forward into the future. So thank you very much. Some acknowledgements here.
All right. Thank you, John, for that great presentation. Okay, so I see Ken has his hand raised here. One moment.
Hi, it's Ken Farr speaking. Thanks very much, John, for a nicely evolved and moving forward look at assisted migration. My question is, how much study have you seen of intra-species variation that might identify local climate assisted migration rockstar individual trees, provenances that might make the best choice for staying with local provenances, but assuring some response to climate change at the same time? Thanks.
Yes, that's a good question, Ken. I would say I have not seen a whole lot of that kind of work. I think the focus has been more on the movements in that assisted migration context. One of the topics I didn't present here, but is related, is another study that Dan and I were involved with, and we call this a range position consideration around assisted migration. And that's the notion that what we've found is that a lot of species in the northern part of the range are actually wanting to grow in warmer climates, particularly for northern species like we'd find in Canada here. So another option with, you could almost put it under the umbrella of assisted migration, but it's really not assisted migration, is to look for species, let's say at your planting site, assess the species that are already there and that are in the northern part of their range. And those are likely species that are going to already have some climate change resilience baked in the local populations, and you might get some positive responses to climate change without moving anything around. So hopefully that gets a bit at your question.
Yeah, that does. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
So it looks like we have a couple of questions in the Q&A pod as well. I'll just address the first one here. It says, FGCA showed a picture of significant differences in growth of red oak seedlings along a gradient range from south to north. Was that a proper study?
Yeah, good question. And I always feel a little bit odd downplaying the importance of movements, because I know those pictures are out there and I've seen them myself. But when I look at the data, I don't always see these big differences. Now, to be clear, there was some growth differences with red oak, I believe, between the local seed source and the far southern ones. So that wouldn't totally surprise me that a picture could be used to show that. I guess the other thing I'd mention is that really when we're doing these assisted migration movements, we're not really doing it for immediate growth improvements. We're doing it for growth improvements down the road. So it could be that you make that movement, as long as things survive and sort of grow okay during the first few decades, then what we're hoping to see is that growth payoff moving forward into the future.
Great, thank you, John. Another question we have here is, when using the plant hardiness site, what is your advice on resolving differences in predictions between Anuklum and Maxent? I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correct.
That's a good point. It's a good question. Well, I mean, I guess I have my bias, and then it's probably just because I'm a bit old school, but I would probably rely on the ANUCLIM approach there, just because it's so transparent and it's so clear what it's doing. It really is just, taking your known occurrence locations, summarizing the climate at those locations, and then mapping where that climate is found. Whereas with the MaxEnt, there's always this bit of uncertainty around exactly what it's doing, and I have certainly come across issues where there do seem to be some unexplained results using MaxEnt. So I guess my advice there would be to maybe lean towards ANUCLIM in those situations. I mean, the best case scenario is, of course, when they overlap nicely, and you can feel sort of more confident about the projections in that case.
Great. And then the final question I have here is, do you have any special considerations for isolated areas with a limited north-south range, such as the island of Newfoundland?
I guess the fact that, we're talking about, say, and let's use the island of Newfoundland then as an example. I don't know if I would have special considerations there. I'd maybe have to give that a little bit more thought. In theory, you could use tools like seedware or the plant hardiness site to help identify some suitable seed sources for use in that situation. I'm trying to think of potential challenges with that because of the isolation side of things. I'm not sure I'm coming up with any special considerations on that. I don't know. Dan McKenney's on the line too. I'm not sure if you're seeing anything there, Dan.
It is a good question. I mean, one thing about Newfoundland is it's also affected very strongly by wind,
Right.
which is not
Right.
something that's explicitly in the models. But I mean, in a certain way, one can also envision this, that, for anybody, Southern Ontario or other parts of Canada, the fact that Newfoundland is an island doesn't really matter. It's a particular set of locations. And if you're getting there wouldn't be the same kind of north-south gradient that you would get, going from, let's say, Ontario down to Pennsylvania or Tennessee, but you're just having to jump across the pond, so to speak, to get to other parts of Canada and Eastern North America. So the seedware tool, you can take a box and do your analysis across a larger geographic range that includes more southern areas. So that could be something. It's an exploratory thing. I guess if you do have some specific questions you want, you could certainly get in touch with us afterwards, and we can have more of a conversation that would be that could perhaps prompt us to think about some things and talk.
Yeah.
Thank you all for participating in today's webinar. And once again, a huge thank you to John for the great presentation.
Thanks. It was great to be here.
Great. Okay. Bye, everyone.